Okay, let's make a start. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Andrew Laird and I'm the Managing Director of Mutual Ventures, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this How to Build Back Better webinar. By way of introduction, Mutual Ventures is a consultancy that specialises in public service design and implementation. We focus on making public services better, more sustainable, and importantly for this discussion, more connected to communities. We work with councils, NHS organisations, as well as charities and social enterprises. And I think one of the key things we do, which I think is relevant here, is we work closely with central government departments and very much act as a link between what they're trying to achieve through policy and linking that with local delivery. So to set the scene, local authorities, public services and community leaders face an unprecedented set of challenges as they look to lead their local areas out of the COVID-19 crisis. However, it's not all terrible news, because across the country, we've seen never before experienced cooperation between communities and also between the public sector and what's going on in communities. But there are some key questions which we will attempt to address today. First of which being, what are the implications of COVID-19 for the government's levelling up agenda? How to build relationships and the governance to facilitate the partnership working that is required between central government and local government, between different public service agencies, and between the public sector and communities. And then finally, how do we avoid a return to normal business as usual, what we experienced before the crisis, and how do we avoid that by locking in the positive changes that have happened during the crisis? And without conscious effort, people and organizations will drift back to doing what they've always done. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our two guests. Danny Kruger is the MP for Devizes, and he has produced what I consider to be the most compelling piece of policy writing emerging from the COVID-19 crisis. At the end of June, Danny was asked by the PM to explore, and I will crudely summarise, how public services and communities can work more effectively together to meet the challenges we face as a population, and what lessons can we learn from the response. Before becoming an MP, Danny founded the youth crime prevention charity Only Connect, which works with men and women in prison or recently released, with the aim of helping them live crime-free lives. We're also delighted to welcome Damian Allen. Damian has been the Chief Executive of Doncaster Council since June last year, having previously been the Director of People, which includes being the DCS and the DAS. The team at Mutual Ventures have worked with Damian across a number of programs, across a number of years, and have always found him to be one of the most innovative and creative leaders in the public services arena. And I'm particularly looking forward to hearing his reflections on how Doncaster has attempted to deal with COVID at a local level, and also his thoughts on how things ought to be going forward. And finally, for the panel discussion, I will be joined by my Mutual Ventures colleagues, Agata Miskovic and Alyssa Davies. And as a point of housekeeping, I invite everybody to use the Q&A function to submit questions. Agata and Alyssa will be monitoring these and will put those questions to the panel. And we'll do our best to get as many as possible asked, and those which we can't ask, if we can, we will follow up with written answers later on. So, without further ado, I am going to now hand over to Danny. You're very welcome, Danny.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good to be with you all. I'm been very inspired by Mutual Ventures over the last few years. We worked together when I was a civil servant at the culture department, working on what became the civil society strategy, which placed an emphasis on the role of mutuals and public service innovations to take us forward. I'll return to that in a moment. The inspiration for the report I have written for government was my own experience, shared by almost every MP, and it's remarkable how much MPs, obviously from across all parties, resonated with this theme, which is the quite remarkable degree both of community willingness, the sort of capital, human social capital in our communities, which we'd always talked about and somewhat piously praised, but really saw in action during the first lockdown, and secondly, the extent to which other agencies in a community discovered a flexibility and a spirit of collaboration which we didn't think they had. So most obviously local authorities, and Damian will no doubt talk about that. And I was hugely impressed in Wiltshire, where I'm an MP, by the willingness first of the town council and then of the county council to respond to this upsurge in neighbourliness and volunteering, the whole mutual aid phenomenon, to respond by facilitating, enabling, supporting that work rather than attempting to direct it, or even worse, to sideline and effectively replicate it through its own offices. Local authorities realised quite quickly that they wouldn't be able to cope with the demands of the self-isolating and the shielding families and households on their own, and moreover that it would be inappropriate to do so. This kind of work is so much more meaningful and, in a sense, valid, acceptable, if it is neighbour to neighbour, and that was phenomenal. So I was inspired by that, and so when the Prime Minister asked me to think about how to sustain that spirit, I looked to my own area, but also I called on a whole bunch of other people, including Andrew and Mutual Ventures, to help me think through how we might sustain that spirit and, in a sense, formalise it as part of the ongoing model for our society that we need, which is what I'm guilty of what I call corona confirmation bias, which I think many of us are guilty of, which is the pandemic has confirmed what we thought before, and we now think it even more. Anyway, so what I thought before and think even more is that we need a social model which is more local, more human, less decentralized, less centralized, and less bureaucratic, and in which big business and big government know their place, and we have a greater emphasis on community power and on the innovations that can develop if you trust people and professionals and places. So what we need to do, and what I propose, is some mechanisms to empower communities directly with what I call the right to serve, which is the obligation on public sector agencies, public services and local authorities to open up and to admit into the policy design and, if appropriate, the policy delivery, the organisations that represent communities, whether that's residents or even public service professionals themselves. But we should not conclude that the only legitimate authority is that held by somebody who's ultimately line managed from Whitehall. And so we have some suggestions around that. I think what would be really tremendous is to get more backing from government, central and local, for quasi-independent hubs in communities where different services can be co-delivered or co-located, and that means trusting civil society more to host that kind of work. Not everything has to be in public sector buildings. There's a commitment in our manifesto, the Conservative Manifesto, for family hubs, which I think is a very important opportunity to deliver much more joined up services around children and families, but the model applies more widely. I'm very keen on mutuals, obviously, and on spin-outs from the public sector, and I regret the loss of momentum in that space in recent years. There were a lot of spin-outs in the coalition years, not so much since, and I'd like to see that revived. And I'd like to see more powers for community asset transfer, for assets of social value, and all different mechanisms by which we can ensure that important social institutions are not lost to the community just because if they're a public landlord or owner, they can't make it pay anymore. That shouldn't be the end for a community asset. I'll finish with this observation that we have discovered this incredible resource. There've been two great discoveries recently. One is the discovery of place, and I always find it rather amusing that Whitehall and Westminster has woken up to the existence of geography and physical community, and the fact that people are meaningfully attached to their neighbourhoods rather than sort of free-floating units, and that policy would be much better delivered if it were designed around place. And that realisation has sunk in, I think, and is now beginning to be operationalised in various ways. The discovery more recently during this crisis has been the discovery of people and the capabilities that we have in our communities, skills, expertise, but also just compassion, time, and grit. And it has been a really, really wonderful and remarkable thing. And I don't think we can go back. I don't think people will accept going back to the status quo ante when we more or less trusted large agencies in glass offices in big cities to manage local life. So I think we are on a trajectory now, and much needs to be done to embed it. But I'm hugely inspired by what's been happening, and I think, looking through the attendee list here, many people here are doing all of this work already, and we just need to form a really loud movement for change. That cuts across party. I was speaking to a bunch of leaders from Bristol Council today, Labour politicians, and the local MP there. This is an agenda which, frankly, the party should be fighting over who owns it and collaborating to deliver it. So I think we've got some good work that we can do. Andrew, back to you.
Thank you very much, Danny. That really sets the scene nicely for us and is a good summary of your report, which if anybody hasn't read it, you really should. Can I, before going to Damian, can I just ask a quick follow-up question? You made the very valid point about people, discovering geographies and realizing that local communities had agency and were resourceful. It feels to me that there's been a bit of a pulling between the response to a crisis, which you kind of, central government feels the necessity sometimes to try and centralize things, whereas actually the best responses have come from the ground up. How do you think that they're going to resolve that tension? And I know that your report makes good suggestions for doing that, but I just wonder if you wouldn't mind saying a bit more about that.
Yes, I mean, it is the essential tension, and it's not an easy. I don't think we should just use rhetoric to obliterate that tension, because we can talk about the importance of community ownership and leadership and localism without very easily, but there are practical issues here, and I mean, I'm very conscious of the challenges over the test and trace system that exists at the moment, which has been was primarily a centralised one to begin with, and I've had my criticisms of that in principle, but actually, and I believe we should be trusting local professionals more and empowering volunteers and so on to be part of the system. But to be fair to the government, they actually have done that from the beginning. There has been a local aspect to test and trace, and even now, while more and more resources are going to the local, there has to be a central structure and system for helping, frankly, to triage the easy cases, so that the local public health professionals don't have to do work on those, and to move resources around the country when needed. So I understand recently so resources were moved from Essex to Leicestershire, I think, to help with the outbreak there in a way that wouldn't have worked if we had a purely local system, or it would have been more of a challenge. I say that just as an example of where I do have some sympathy with the centralising impulse. It is appropriate in some ways. I just think we have to have quite a profound acknowledgement that power ultimately derives from the local and from communities, and embed that principle in the way we design and deliver public services. But the precise balance of power between central and local is going to have to be worked out in quite an adult way, depending on the service. Yeah,
okay. Many thanks, Danny. Damian, over to you. I think my colleague Agatha is going to share your slides, and Damian, just in case, before anybody asks, Damian is willing for us to share his slides once he's finished his presentation. So Damian, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Danny. I have a passionate belief that all action should be socially situated and socially embedded in the place. We all have a sense of origin, we all feel a sense of identity, and we certainly feel a sense of belonging to place. So thank you very much for inviting me to take part in today's seminar on a topic that I certainly feel in the middle of at the moment. It reminds me of a quote by Joel Osteen that there are some things you only learn in a storm. And believe me, today it feels like a force 10. So today's about sharing some of the experience live, real time, and learning with you. It's not a lot's been happening in Doncaster over the last 12 months, you might say, slightly ironically, but on the 8th of November 2019, we had a month's worth of rain fall in parts of Yorkshire and 800 homes flooded. And there was a national spotlight on Fishlake Village during the 2-week emergency response period. And if you look behind me, you can see an artifact that I picked out of the floodwaters, which had exceeded that level. On the 22nd of May this year, a fire started on the area of peatland in the Humberhead National Nature Reserve, devastating 1,400 hectares and lasting for 3 weeks during the height of the first wave of COVID-19, necessitating the management of concurrent incidents. And of course, the main and durable incident is coronavirus, which we continue to be in the middle of, dealing with the direct and indirect implications of this pandemic. And I believe that will be going on not just for weeks or months, but we'll be feeling the ramifications for years. This, and I'm looking over at my whiteboard, tells me that it's week 32 of 16 of the critical incident. I say that because the PM optimistically announced it would be all over by June. It isn't. These are all complex adaptive challenges. So in the past 12 months, we've had floods, fires, and plague, and all we probably needed was pestilence to make a full set. Although not a critical incident, we did have, in fact, a nuisance fly outbreak in one of our household waste recycling centres over the summer. So I suppose I should have seen all of this coming, particularly last summer, when I also got a call to evacuate my house as a result of the Whaley Bridge dam emergency. It was clearly an omen. Being called Damian, of course, and being born on the 6th of the 6th, 62, probably doesn't help either. Next slide, please. There are 4 themes I wish to explore rapidly today, all of which overlap and are interwoven together, but stand up in their own rights. And these themes describe for me some of the journey I and colleagues have been on and are still going through here in Doncaster. Some of them touch on the personal and the wider system of systems we operate, and dare I say, in Danny's company, the political context in which we all have to work as well. Next slide, please. Initially, it was helpful because I think we were already in a collective leadership mindset. And on the first day of the floods in November, we were due to have a partnership summit on how to take a locality approach across the borough. The borough is the largest metropolitan borough in England and a place of many distinct places. And the first step in our collective leadership mindset was our understanding that we needed to be closer to communities as a means to ensure more of what we do is with and by communities. We'd also been on a very large-scale engagement exercise called Doncaster Talks, and we mobilised a set of local creatives to give us some deep and local insight into what life's like in Doncaster and what needs to improve and what should be the focus for the future. And we had a collective desire to find this out, and some of it was quite hard going. But we knew that local insight and conversations, which I believe are the currency of change, were essential to our thinking. We published our COVID-19 10-point action plan prior to the lockdown on the 20th of March. And as we'd been in emergency mode recently, there was already a collective understanding by partners, which made some of the earlier work easier. And we used the 3 Horizons tool devised by Bill Sharp and Tony Hodgson of H3 University to shape our mindset throughout the various situations we've faced in Doncaster, but also across South Yorkshire as I chair the local resilience forum as well. And for much of that time, we've been operating at the edge of chaos. And the edge of chaos is that space between where the right balance exists between order and chaos, often referred to as the zone of criticality, where self-organization, emergence, innovation and creativity are most possible. And it's felt like we've been operating here for a while. And although tiring, it's yielded some fantastic innovations, which has allowed us to achieve things which may never have happened under normal times. More of those later. I want to share some excellent points here by my old boss, Steve Mumby, around the humility of leading, all of which resonated with me as I reviewed the decisions and the collective work with colleagues over the past 9 months or so. Next slide, please. I want to spend a little bit of time on complexity. And I thought this tweet by Nora Bateson at the weekend was very pertinent to our current situation. There's some other statements here by a colleague, Peter Miles, of Complexity Solutions, who I first started working with on looking at the impact of complexity on a leadership perspective in the public sector 15 years ago. Fundamentally, this is how we've operated, and COVID has been an extraordinary time, but it's not just in times of crisis or emergency that this ought to be relevant. It's something that is equally relevant when we talk about the interactions of economic, social, and environmental policies and the outcomes we want for our place and our people. Variety, change, and influencing systems come with the territory, and our ability or inability to respond to each of these will dictate how we navigate complex and interlinked issues and problems. Next slide, please. Characteristic was generating design in practice, or systems thinking in action, if you like. And operating in a crisis allows you to shed everything but the problem. And in this case, how do we know that the flows between different settings, and at the time to be ahead of hospital settings, which could have been potentially overwhelmed? I have to tell you that my 8 a.m. call this morning with all of the hospital CEOs felt a rather deja vu, except that this time we have the benefit of this population flow model. Although I have to tell you, it's an even more complex challenge now. Today is a critical moment, therefore, for our local complex adaptive system. And the crisis allowed us, I think, to rip up the rule book and share data and ideas in a dynamic and agile way. And we developed this population flow model in the gap between the first 2 meetings of our emergency health cell. It's a good example of what you can create at the edge of chaos, and how we designed, produced and iterated it whilst using the information in real time. It started off as 4 boxes. There are now over 40. This is the focus that actually binds people into the whole systems approach. But throughout the entire process, we've also been intelligence driven. And part of that picture is understanding the views and the feelings of people. And these insights helped to drive, motivate and guide what we do. And we asked about lockdown, and residents said they experienced social isolation and were not able to plan for the future. And we asked them about what the council services were that they most value. It's heartening to know that some things don't change, because waste and green waste came at the top of that list. We also asked people to report symptoms before there was any really good data for testing that was available. We had over 3,000 people self-report. And those symptoms allowed us to use that data as a proxy for community transmission. And we asked parents how they felt about the schools reopening in June. And we received over 9,000 responses in 24 hours, which helped us democratize some of the decision-making that the mayor then made at that point, which was to delay for 2 weeks. Next slide, please. It's already been mentioned, but our community hubs were a fantastic example of how partners came together and made something happen within days and weeks. And we'd mobilized helplines, volunteers, delivered hundreds of food parcels, pharmacy deliveries, and much more besides. We saw the emergence of new organizations, individuals helping each other, and also street level self-organization. And the stories we can tell from this reminds us of the moral imperative of being compassionate. And at the heart of this work are people in a multitude of circumstances. But interestingly, when we did some ethnographic research, over 95% of those people that were shielded did not want any ongoing support, as they were getting it from elsewhere. Communities are stronger than we give them credit for. It reinforced our work towards our locality model with our 4 elements of integrated area-based working, area commissioning, area governance, and asset-based community development. And at key moments, key messages are needed. When a clear decision is needed to be made, it's important to ensure a clear, evidence-based message is delivered. And our Director of Public Health did this through his calm, concise, and clear messages that engendered trust and added legitimacy, whilst also being the consistent public face out there. And he'll be doing that again tomorrow. Sometimes, however, you need to be slightly eccentric and creative. Hopefully you'll have heard of our exploding whale story on Twitter. We use lessons from history as a means to encourage people through behavioural change to follow the rules and stay at home. These were a blend of bizarre historic hooks, humour and factoids, latter-day fables if you like. This story alone received over 13 million impressions on social media. We also established a weekly newsletter distribution to people in the borough. We now have over 100,000 email addresses we speak to on a weekly basis, and a further segmenting on a locality basis to better target incidents and events at a more granular level. Next slide, please. So what matters for the future? Well, tough decisions are not going away, and we do need to be intelligence-led, and we need to locally situate the implications. And some of the decisions are not easy, and we're constantly balanced on the horns of dilemmas. For example, the St. Leger horse race, the oldest flat race in the country. Having decided to open it, having met 10 tests, we had to close it to the public after the first day. The decision to delay the reopening of schools that I've already referenced. And there's more to come, no doubt, when we discuss with number 10 tomorrow, the rationale for even stricter restrictions, having only just been identified as high in the new three-tier system. So keeping a hopeful outlook and finding the space for the long term are also important. In this regard, I subscribe to Václav Havel's eyes wide open definition of hope. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. We need to continue to progress what is important and maintain, however difficult, for example, our Climate Change and Biodiversity Commission and report, which is due out shortly, our Restart, Recovery and Renewal Plan, which is our bridge to a 10-year long-term borough strategy. But we also need to continue to tackle inequalities and level up our communities. And although the pandemic has shone a light on some of these inequalities, we have known that these inequalities have existed for some time. And the example of Black Lives Matters, the widening of educational and health outcomes have been exacerbated, but they were there pre-COVID. So empowering communities, building capacity and celebrating the work of the VCF sector is the way to truly deliver the community-led transformation we all need. And learning from the experiences of the lockdown, as Danny's report so cogently articulates. So as leaders, we do need to be dealers in hope. And it's my job to ensure that the people and the place of Doncaster thrives, even though this has been a personally difficult time for many residents with multiple and ongoing strains and tests of their resolve. Never has there been such a relevant council motto as ours, one that sums up the spirit of the people and a place in these most difficult of times. Be steadfast. Next slide, please. So in concluding, I don't have all of the answers, but I would invite you to live inside some of these questions, which I'll leave with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damian. Much appreciated. Really good, detailed analysis of how your council has responded to the crisis there. I've just Googled the exploding whale story there. It's worth a look for people who haven't come across it. Some very good advice. Yeah. Just a very quick question for you, Damian, before I start into the more general questions. You mentioned your hubs there, community hubs. Is that something that you think is just there to deal with the crisis, or do you think actually the way public services and communities have come together through the hubs might make that something more structural and lasting?
Well, it's interesting because it implies it's a physical hub. And obviously it was focused in and around the humanitarian aid that government organised. But what we are doing now in looking at our humanitarian aid and our localities approach, we've already got a template which enables us to lean into a way of doing things at a locality level. So we've maintained some of those organisations, some of which sprung up, as I say, in the midst of COVID. But also it was timely because it was at the point in time that we're introducing area-based budgets for ward members. And what we did was we lent those ward member budgets into the focus on COVID. And they had the freedom and flexibility to direct some of those resources. And in so doing, they've created, I suppose, a network and a mesh of engagement, which shifts their role far more from what can sometimes just be the Friday night sort of surgery into much more community activism and advocacy and indeed agency.
Okay, thank you. So Danny, a question for you to start with, and just a message to everybody listening. Please do use the Q&A function to put your questions in there. We've had some really good ones, but there is room for more, I would say. So Danny, what are the implications of COVID-19 on the levelling up agenda? And is this a distraction, or is it the wake-up call that this agenda really needs to get going, do you think?
Well, I mean, I framed my report around the levelling up agenda because, I mean, partly just to get, make it topical, but and say that this is about more than just sort of COVID response. But, we are seeing in the crisis the reality of our social divides, aren't we? We're seeing them around places because it's the north and northeast and northwest, particularly being hit by the second spike. And we're seeing it's the more deprived members of the community that are getting the brunt of the illness as well. So we have a massive social crisis, as a social injustice is being exacerbated and revealed by this disease, and the imperative for levelling up, for making opportunity and prosperity more evenly divided, with all of the implications of that, and it is now very acute. My view is that if levelling up does not put this agenda, the role of civil society, of social infrastructure, of agency, and in fact of public service reform at its heart, if it's simply about redistributing capital spending and economic infrastructure to what we call left behind areas, then we will fail, because there has been capital investment over the years in the regions which struggle, and on its own it doesn't work. You need to have social investment, and you need to have investment in social infrastructure, and you need to think about the services and the systems that people operate in. So I try and make the argument that to regenerate left behind towns, we need to be recognizing the assets that exist there, seeing very much struck by one of Damian's slides there that emphasized the asset-based way of approaching this work, and that also puts people in charge. So levelling up must not be the latest syndrome of Whitehall doing stuff to the regions. It has to be about empowerment, and as I say, it has to be about social infrastructure too, which is why, going back to your agenda, Andrew, I think the role of mutuals and public services being led by the people who deliver them and the people who they serve, rather than by remote officials, is absolutely central.
Okay, many thanks, Danny. Damian, I wonder what your view on this is, sat where you are at a more local level. Certainly, Danny's a local MP, but you within the council, on the levelling up agenda and how this could be an opportunity. I don't like to use that word in the midst of a crisis, but could this be an opportunity for areas which, as to use Danny's phrase, have been left behind to in a sense catch up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't particularly like the the language of left behind, it implies that actually there's no agency. You know, I do think there's an enormous amount of historical disadvantage, but actually that isn't a lead weight. You know, the power of the people is really important. So a couple of comments around the extent to which local authorities are willing to give up power. I mean, I think you have to give away power. You have to have a fundamentally democratizing view of the benefit of engaging the citizenry. That puts pressure and challenges on the established power structures, including the role of local members that I've talked about. So, I mean, I see it as a potential shot in the arm, or at least I want to believe that that's what it can be. And certainly, in terms of asset-based community development, we've worked with Cormac Russell to look at what that looks and feels like, and you know, it's what's strong, not what's wrong. And within that, you know, we've had some good prototype work in Denby, one of the areas looking at well Denby, where we're looking at social enterprise, social innovation. I think we've sort of, you know, whether you like it or not, the conditions have created out of a necessity people's resourcefulness and people's inventiveness, and also that focus around compassion to come together. And I think that creativeness has created a sort of a more fundamental, compassionate place. And I know these aren't popular things to say, because coming back to Danny's point, it's all about a more structured economic regeneration. I do think we have had a deficit in social investment, and that we ought to see that as a much more sustainable approach. And that comes back to the way in which we view growth. You know, I'm very taken by the circular economy and the need to keep resources and to recycle those resources within the place, whilst recognizing also a agglomerative scale requires you to have big regeneration and infrastructure, because it does create the sort of the jobs, and that comes back to where would you invest. And we're very much keen to look at the green energy, green tech, digitization, automation, but also recognizing that we've now got a blended way of working that also fits around people's real lives rather than outmoded modalities of working. So I'm much more hopeful, but it's through the lens of that Václav Havel, eyes wide open.
Many thanks, Damian. I think there's maybe a slight disagreement on language, but I think it's a very similar message, actually. The questions are coming in pretty thick and fast now, so I'm going to hand over to Agata to take us through some of those. Agata.
Thank you, Andrew. First, a follow-up question for Damian, which links to what you just said about shifting power and changing modalities of work. And this is a question from Paul. How can local authorities shift their behavior, particularly around power, as a result of really listening to communities? For example, hearing the voices of lived experience, when there's arguably a culture for learned helplessness brought on by years of cuts and criticism. So in other words, how can we really lock in positive changes brought by COVID and make sure that what has been done will be sustained?
Well, the first thing is, and I think I referenced it, is listening. I mentioned we've done some ethnographic research. We've done a huge amount of insight-based research, which surfaces more of the how people feel and, you know, those less tangible aspects of life, but nonetheless the things that actually give you the lived experience. And understanding that lived experience is a much better basis on which to construct a set of design principles for new modes, new models, and new players, which I know is very much at the heart of where MV exists. But also it's about not just listening and amplifying the voice, but it's actually about co-producing the solutions. And so, for instance, we had a big challenge with our CVS. It had stuttered. So we worked with 5 what I'd call anchor voluntary sector organisations to come up with a review and a new model themselves. It was done by them for the sector, and that's called Voluntary Action Doncaster. You know, we've invested in that. The other thing for me is we've also looked to scaffold the system. And that's about, so for instance, we've created a number of what I'd call middle tier organisations. So we had Expect Youth, which was an organisation that we invested in a little bit like a startup strategy, really. One-off money is easy to come by rather than sort of revenue. So we invested in them with the expectation that they would raise some of their own revenue, but they would impact on outcomes. And they have been phenomenal. They've delivered our staycation offer over the whole of the summer, but they've been doing it for the last 3 or 4 years. And without that capacity in place, and equally they have a role to build the micro sector as well in terms of supporting accredited training for small voluntary sector youth facilities. We've done the same with the social isolation forum, where we've done the same. So it's about adopting different roles in terms of the facilitation, the design, the support, the funding. Rather than believing that you should be there to do it, you need to ensure it's done.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And there's another question for Danny this time. You've listed a long list of much needed and welcome initiatives. So what would you say are the most immediate priorities for government off the back of your report?
Thank you. Well, very quickly, I think the most important one is, well, two. One's about money and the other's about people. I think we should be putting significant funding into local civil society, and I propose the use of the National Fund, which exists. It's a great big £500 million worth of money that's sitting there not being used because it's set up as a charity to pay off the national debt 100 years ago, and unfortunately 500 million is not going to do that. Even though the fund has grown a lot over the last 100 years, the debt's grown quicker. So I think, and government is now looking about how to repurpose that money. I think it should be used to support civil society during the crisis. I also think we should be using there's some other much bigger dormant assets coming on stream that should be used to set up a permanent endowment for civil society and for social infrastructure. So there's a piece around money, and then what about people is we need to organise or formalise or provide some infrastructure for the voluntary effort that will be needed in the next stages of this crisis. And we can't just rely on spontaneous mutual aid to do the work that's going to be needed for we're going to have more intense, complicated, complex, multiple challenges for many, many households. And I think we need what I describe as a volunteer passport, which is an idea that's been around for a while. I think we now have the will and the data and the experience to deliver this, which is a portable passport that records your skills and your experience and your qualifications and obviously your DBS check and everything else, and enables much better broking, matching of supply and demand for voluntary effort, both for the crisis but also for the ongoing needs of our communities. We need a lot more. We have wonderful volunteering in this country, but it needs to be better managed. But we must not kill it through over-managing and bureaucratizing and setting up a vast government IT system. We need to avoid that danger. But those are my two, I said, biggest and most urgent things that need to be done.
Okay.
Thank you, Danny. And we see that social activism is currently on the rise. And Damian, you've mentioned in your presentation the Black Lives Matter movement, there's the climate activism. And this is a very important part of building a strong civic society, but it can also bring out some tensions. There are people expressing dissatisfaction with government at both central and local level. So how do you deal with public tension or conflict in a constructive way? And how do you harness the positive energy of social movements? Damian, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's a really good question because both of those issues are current. So in terms of Black Lives Matters and wider equality and inequality and social injustice, as part of our Team Doncaster, which is our borough strategic partnership, again, emerging from the voluntary community sector and the protected groups, we have a Fairness and Inclusion Forum, which is a network of networks, which is intended to try and broaden the franchise for access and amplifying voice. The difficulty, of course, is that, whilst that's a necessary front end of any challenge to build a head of steam, some people get stuck in the echo chamber rather than how do you move people on to a more productive and focused agenda to get stuff done. And I have a bias to action in most of the things I do. And I would argue that we're abreast that at the moment in terms of a focus on that particular agenda. And people are on different journeys, but we've got some, again, the challenge of leadership is you've got to lead by example. So as an organisation, we've listened and we've heard, and we've had some uncomfortable conversations. And I think, this isn't about managing conversations. Sometimes it's about listening and hearing, and that can be deeply disturbing at times. And I think from a personal perspective, that has been part and continues to be part of my own journey, particularly with Black Lives Matters. In terms of the environmental activism, where I stand personally and where I sit professionally are two different places. And the tension within, it's always the hardest conversation, is with oneself. But we've got a climate change and biodiversity commission, which is a broad church of opinions, and it's chaired by Ed Miliband, who was previous Secretary of State and now the opposition spokesperson, and trying to get a consensus from that range of views about the report, for instance, has been an interesting experience. And actually, rather than trying to get a consensus, appreciating the diversity of perspectives and being able to reflect those within the report, but getting a sufficient consensus or a rough enough consensus gives you the critical mass to move forward. And that, I think, is about how you engage and how you articulate the key priorities, again, being evidence-based. But at the same time, you can have all the evidence you like, but if you can't build consensus and commitment to act, then you're not going to make anything change.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Damian. Thank you, Agata. We're going to pass over to Alyssa now, who's been looking at some of the questions which have come in. Alyssa, do you want to take us from here?
So the first one is from Simon Lovegrove. I'm going to paraphrase it slightly, Simon, because it's quite long, but it's about the dominance of the NHS. So recognising the NHS as a fantastic organisation, as we move kind of into integrated care and beyond that, who is kind of best placed to lead on strategic health and care when you're moving into a kind of support space rather than necessarily a kind of curative space? So I think probably, Damian, if we go to you first and then we come to Danny next.
Well, I think we have too centralised a system when it comes to the national health system. Don't get me wrong, I'm fiercely proud of it as an institution, but it's too clunky and it's too slow, and it's a national unhealthy system, rather than what we ought to be doing is focusing on Marmot's work, which is now over a decade old, and looking at population health management. And it's amazing how we're seeing some of the emergent issues around emotional, mental well-being within this set of, it's not responsive enough for that. Having said that, I'm pretty clear that the challenges that are faced with my colleagues in the acute sector mean that, we do need to focus on the priority of saving lives as well as protecting livelihoods. So I think, the integrated care system, I mentioned earlier the population flow model. I've been articulating that since 2005, the need for this. We did it in 2 weeks in a crisis. Yet I've spent the last 5 years here trying to get the governance model right. And don't get me wrong, we're very cooperative, we're very keen, and we're very positive as partners. But it just doesn't, it isn't expeditious enough, and it's too bureaucratic. And I think, there's a need to be much closer to, the governance needs to be owned much more closely. And we need to get the balance right. But then it also reflects the comment that Danny made when you asked him about the difference between central and local. For me, I think we're a highly centralised governing nation. There's not enough delegation and devolvement of power to the regions, to the local areas, and that's going to be an ongoing theme. I usually sum this up by referencing to Stormy Norman Schwarzkopf from the First Gulf War, where he characterised the distinction between central command and forward control. And he says it's a little bit like your cooked breakfast. Yeah, the chicken's involved, but the pig's fairly committed.
Thanks, Damian. Danny, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on kind of who should lead strategically, the NHS or local government or someone else.
Brilliant, from Schwarzkopf. Okay, well, I've echoed that. I mean, well put by Damian, and that is the answer. It's, and I think you put it in your question as well about we need to be focusing on health creation, not sort of just treating illness. And and I think the whole model and spirit of the NHS is undergoing a rapid evolution in that direction, which is very positive. And I was impressed during this crisis by how CCGs, health authorities, suddenly started looking outwards, not just answering the phone from councils and civil society, but actually making their own phone calls out, which is, so there's been positive things are happening. We do probably need to think about governance and the eternal question of the link with social care. I had an anxious moment in the middle of the crisis when Matt Hancock started wearing a badge saying care to reflect natural priority on the care sector, but he has his NHS badge and then he put his care badge on, and I had a sudden fear that we were going to do what some people have argued for, which is to create a national care service and show how much we love the care sector by basically either amalgamating it with the NHS or creating a sort of NHS for care. I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I asked a question in the Commons the other day about this and was assured by the care minister that wasn't the plan. We actually need to fix the social care system and then make the NHS more like it. It's the sequence I think we need to do. We need to get a social care system we can be really proud of, because the actual structures of it are good. Plural supply side, proper integration with local authorities, a focus on big role for voluntary and what might we call informal care in the community, residential care, role for the private sector and civil society. But we need it properly funded and to be effectively integrated. And that's the model that I would like to see in the health service as well.
Thanks, Danny. And we've got another question for you next. So Roberta Cole is asking about the mutuals movement, and in particular, how can mutuals be given a truly equal footing in their local public sector marketplaces? And she references some of the challenges around tenders and kind of contracts, but also around social investment and kind of evidencing impact.
Okay, well, it sounds like she knows what she's talking about. And I just think we need to have government at all levels recover the enthusiasm for mutuals that we had a few years ago. And it might be there are other sectors where we could lead. Andrew would have a view. I think health sort of led the way in the first stage, and maybe there are other parts of the public sector which could follow now. But yeah, we do need more sort of political support. I think the practical stuff, just needs to be worked out. I was quite encouraged by the new focus on social value commissioning. So that when government published my report and Prime Minister's response, they also issued the new social value framework that they've been working on for some time, which is a really important step. And basically it takes the best models of work from the local government and saying central government's now going to operate in this way. And I hope that will have a stimulating effect across the public sector, so that all commissioners really prioritise social value, and that will be a great boost to the social economy in general, but to mutuals in particular. So there'll be a lot of, I'm afraid it's fairly tactical stuff that probably needs to be done. My focus is on trying to get recognition of the importance of this agenda, and I hope that will feed into the way commissioners operate.
Yeah, Alyssa, if I can just come in briefly there, I think what you say is exactly right there, Danny. There's a huge range of areas which could benefit from this agenda. Everything from public health to social care to libraries, even as you talk about in your report. And it is certainly an agenda that has lost momentum. It seems that there has been an ongoing commitment to it, but it just seems to get interrupted by other things like this crisis or Brexit or whatever, and it does get pushed off the agenda. It's not the only way of delivering services, but it is. I think what we've seen is that council areas that have a really good, I think Damian, you called it an anchor institution or two. We sometimes call them bridge organizations. So really good community-based partners, whatever their form, that have a foot in communities, but a really strong commissioning relationship with the formal public sector. Areas that have those organisations have been able to respond really flexibly in a time of crisis. So it is an interesting resilience strategy for local areas to consider the need for those organisations. Alyssa, back to you.
Yeah, so just one, I think, follows on quite nicely from that question from Carol Stump about the importance of libraries at the heart of communities, and any comments on the importance of libraries as part of the solution to recovery. Damian, if we maybe go to you first on that one.
Yeah, really like this question. I've had the benefit of having the oversight of libraries for about 15 years in various roles, and see the significance of them being more than just the holders of book repositories. So we have a network of community libraries, and they offer so much more than just, we have something called bump spaces where people come in, literally, they are opportunities to sit down, have a conversation, engage, and as well as have a coffee, but at the same time, hopefully avail themselves of the services of some decent books. The issue for me, I think, is that libraries in the 21st century have to sort of reinvent what they are, and it's about more than just the written media. Interestingly, I'm sat next to probably one of the first or the newest library buildings. It's more than a library. It's the Daneham Gallery, Library and Museum, all one building, and a creative incubator space for creatives as well. And it opens whenever, pending COVID, in the new year. It will also hold two full-size steam locomotives that were built in the Doncaster sheds in 1936, whenever we get them in, and probably one of the biggest memorabilia railway collections that you've seen that has not been seen so far. But it's also a museum for the King's Own Light Infantry Regiment as well. So for me, it's about the, and of course it's been quite topical, it's about understanding what culture is in the place, and, going back to my earlier comment about connecting people, and Danny's point about family hubs. What we need is nodes within the system that allow people to meet, to engage, and to educate themselves. And libraries have been doing that to the public good for nigh on 150, 200 years. And you won't get a stronger supporter of libraries, and particularly libraries in the community. If you look at the network of intermediate labour and support and volunteering that clusters around them, they have been some of the focal areas for the work that I was discussing earlier.
Thanks, Damian. Great. And Danny, did you want to quickly add to that before we?
Yeah, of course we must stop, but I mean, I know, completely echo that. I'm very excited by the potential for libraries to be both. I mean, they're old and new. Like this great thing about this agenda. You can be sort of nostalgic conservative like me, or sort of modernizer like Andrew, and it's all the same agenda. And libraries have a huge role to play as the hubs of communities, the repository of the memory of a place, but also modernising the old idea, which was that they were the gateway to the world. They were the opportunity for adult education. They were the place where businesses could start. And they're increasingly, the best libraries have these amazing facilities. And they should also be tasked with the job of getting the 9 million people who are not on the internet onto it, well, those who want to be. So they should be places of digital inclusion and provide the infrastructure for communities. They're outstanding. Brilliant. But they could be community owned. The more community owned libraries, the better.
Very good. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Damian. We're out of time now, and just want to say on behalf of everyone, that was a really good discussion. And to everybody listening, it's been recorded and it will be made available on our website, which we'll share through LinkedIn and other channels. Just a few very quick final thoughts from me. It seems what we're largely talking about here is really devolution. It's about getting power to local areas, to councils, working with the NHS, and then those councils looking at how they empower communities. And just a final appeal or thought as a lesson that we've learned working with councils across the country, is that we would encourage everybody to think, make time now to think strategically. It's going to take a huge amount of effort, as you all know, to recover from this, but there is no point recovering to where you were when you could recover to where you're actually trying to get to. So on that note, many thanks everybody, and have a really good rest of your day.